You're watching India Today Global. We're here to discuss the union budget that will be presented tomorrow on the 1st of Feb. And what does that entail for India and India's foreign policy and foreign policy ambitions? To discuss all this and more, I'm being joined by Constantino Xavier. He is Senior Fellow with CSEP, that's Center for Social and Economic Progress. Constantino, thanks for joining us here on India Today Network. We basically would want to focus on and understand what this budget and what the previous budget meant for India's foreign policy, as also the allocation for Ministry of External Affairs and how well did they use the budget. So to begin with, let's just do a comparison of what was the budget in the past as compared to last year and what's expected this year, Constantino.
So overall, it's good news, Geeta. I think after many years of stagnation, growth in the 3%, 4% figures, sometimes even a decrease in the MEA budget. Last year, we saw a growth in 23% year on year. And this year, I expect another growth, maybe not as hard. But it's important to underline, as you mentioned, utilization, importance, that every rupee counts in the MEA budget to accelerate India's interests in the region and beyond. And therefore, we see, I think, a general increase in the MEA budget. Of course, then there's a question of what do you do with each rupee? Where do you put in your buck to get the greatest bang, the greatest impact for India's interests beyond India?
Okay, we will talk about what should India's priorities be. The larger picture over here also is that when we're talking about MEA budget allocations, there are specific areas that MEA deals with, but in the larger perspective of strategic budget allocations, defense also does come in, and therefore the strategic budget allocation is far greater. And the percentage is far higher. But specifically sticking to foreign policy. Now, India has had major foreign policy ambitions, global ambitions, Constantino. Do you think the budget commensurates with the ambitions?
I think the short answer is no. The budget needs to increase systematically, structurally to much higher levels. But also before you increase it, you have to be very clear about what you need it for and where. So sometimes I think more than just an ask, it is important to think also for what. In fact, one of the reasons why often the Ministry of Finance has been reluctant to allocate greater budgetary resources to the Ministry of External Affairs is that there's not really, I think, an appreciation in other ministries of the work the MEA does. You mentioned a word strategic. I think the traditional idea of diplomacy is you have to run a few embassies, you have to do some consular support for the growing Indian diaspora, but really that strategic issues are security, defense, acquisitions, etc. I'd actually argue the MEA plays an extremely strategic role in helping Indian companies going abroad, in accessing foreign direct investment into India. For example, just to give you one example, 10 to 15% of the MEA budget has been going into Bhutan alone. And many people ask themselves, why? Why would you be, sending 4,000 crores every year of rupees into Bhutan? The reason is very simple. In fact, the success is already showing. Today, Bhutan is developing its hydropower to an extent never seen before. It is exporting a lot of it at very favorable prices to India. And in fact, it's thinking about connecting its grid to Bangladesh, which again has a strategic interest because by delivering this to these countries, you are tying them to India, you're connecting them, developing interdependence. Frankly, you're making India out campaigns or anti-India sentiments much more costly and difficult for these countries.
That's a very interesting point, but we do know that Bhutan is a traditional historical partner until the royal family supports and stands with India. There isn't going to be much of a change in Bhutan's foreign policy, but that is also shifting. And Constantino, China is a major factor here in the region as also globally. Now let's just talk about prioritizing what India should be doing in various parts of the world, particularly in the region. Now, we do want to be global players. India does want to be a global player, but is a very important key player in the region itself. how much of India's focus on various budgetary allocations when it comes to aid, development work, all of that should be focused on certain countries in the region, keeping China in mind?
I mean, Bhutan, you mentioned, has been a tradition, but Bhutan is becoming increasingly important. The Chinese
Yes.
are trying to develop relations with Bhutan. They are dying to open up diplomatic relations with Bhutan. So there will be a day, whenever it comes, where China will intensify and formalize its relations with Bhutan. And that is the importance of diplomacy and of what you called strategic again. It is looking out to the future and preparing India's ground today so that wherever China comes in, you are already prepared. You have your stakes on the ground, you have investment happening, you have trade happening. And that's where diplomacy comes in. So if you look at Africa, for example, there are, of course, huge advantages to what the Chinese have been doing in Africa. But there's a window of opportunity today because after years of the Chinese flooding these developing countries in the global south with aid, grants, that came tied sometimes with conditions or was not even absorbable by these countries because it came into difficulties where the Chinese tried to shape governance or frankly didn't cough up the money they promised in the first place. Now there's a window for India to come in and develop sustainable long-term development projects that again are not based on grants, which basically is free money for these countries, but on lines of credit. In fact, we see in our budget analysis a progressive shift in the MEA from grants, which are gifts
To
basically to other
LOCs.
countries,
Yeah.
to lines of credit which come tied to procurement from India. So that helps Indian companies export. And that again creates jobs in India. And as we see in the global south, huge economies of scale in Africa again, for example, and the Chinese struggling in some ways or trying to change gears. This is a moment where India can really step up and it will need, including in the MEA, budget to do this.
Okay, you make a very important point when you make the distinction between grants and loans, and we are moving towards loans, which is what China has been doing in the region. But again, realistically speaking, in the region itself, you spoke about India out campaign and making it costlier for countries to really do away with India. The Maldives is an example, but should you like to prioritize which are the countries that India should be focusing on and maybe has lost focus? The reason why we see more of a foothold, a stronghold that China really has right now in those countries, what is it that India can do to ensure that it gets its space back in those countries?
Very difficult, Geeta. It's the toughest question in a very difficult neighborhood. We have huge expectations about India delivering. One paradox I keep mentioning, which relates to the MEA budget and the MEA effort of Indian diplomacy, is that, frankly, India is doing more than ever for its neighboring countries. It's connecting faster than ever to bridges, railways, roads it's developing, airport linkages, digital systems. It's doing it faster than ever, not only because of the government and the public sector companies that go to these neighboring countries, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, but also because the private sector is now a play in India's neighborhood policy. The problem and the paradox is that despite being better, more, and faster, because of the competition from China and other countries, it's actually still too slow, too little, not good enough. And this is why the countries in the neighborhood that used to say only India out, now only sometimes say India out. And they use it as a bargaining tool, a political bargaining tool to extract more from India. And one thing they do, which you mentioned, is they go to China. Sometimes they threaten to go to China. Sometimes they actually go to China, which was the case of the Maldives, Sri Lanka, which is an important partner for these countries, to again balance and extract more benefits from India. So it's going to be a very difficult game. It's not just an economic game of I have a good financing line for you or we can do more trade. Trade, investments, the economic relationship is going to be weaponized. And the only thing that India can do is to develop its systems, including a stronger budget and stronger systems of delivery, to offer these countries solutions for their developmental benefits. Because if you don't, you will have even more anti-India sentiments and political sentiments. Of course, there are red lines India will not allow to be crossed, but most of the story today in the neighborhood is one of delivery. In fact, I remember the current external affairs minister mentioned in 2018 that an investment in the neighboring countries is an investment in India itself. That is the logic that is gaining ground. It is a difficult one, but we see progress, and there will be competitors, whether it's China, the US, the Europeans, the Japanese, and also more coordination with those countries, because you can't do this alone. Your budget will not be enough even for the next 10 years to do this alone. You'll have to coordinate with other investments of friendly countries to compete and offer alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative and what China is offering.
Again, there are two aspects to it. One is the budget allocation itself. Does India have the money, and does it require partners? You say that it does require partners. The other thing, and a very important one at that, is does India deliver on time? Whether it's the flow of money or working on a project and delivering it to the country, to the said country on time. Does that really happen?
It does. There are still delays, but actually the delays were the rule and the law in India's neighborhood policy in terms of projects. I think now it is the exception. You see, for example, in India-Nepal petroleum products pipeline that was established before its scheduled time of completion. You see a variety of new integrated checkposts coming around India's borderlands. For example, one with Bangladesh, even after August and the difficulties in India-Bangladesh relations. So India is showing up as a more credible, but still not enough credible partner for these countries. And in fact, I always say these countries will never be happy with what India gives. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to sell India in these countries. It's a very big country.
Why do you say that?
It's a next because this is a normal logic of smaller countries that are worried about being connected to India. They're always worried about the weaponization of connectivity. They're worried about, in Sri Lanka, engineers from southern India coming in if you facilitate the labor connectivity. If you're in Bhutan and you're a taxi operator or a truck operator, you are worried about Indian taxis and trucks coming onto your country, which frankly has less population than many districts of India. So these are very smaller countries in different degrees. Bangladesh, of course, is the 8th largest country, but has practically only a border, except a small stretch with Myanmar, with India. So all these countries will always be back-footed. They'll always be reluctant to celebrate. In fact, we saw in the case of Sheikh Hasina, the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, what price she paid to invest in what made all the sense for Bangladesh, which was economic interdependence, revive the railways, the waterways with India, and invest in that connectivity. But selling that at home was not easy for her. And it's become, as we know, since August 5th, even more difficult under the new regime.
The allegiances, alliances, or leanings certainly play a very important role. We have seen how change in governments in various countries in the neighborhood has led to either aid increasing or decreasing. In this case, I see an article that you and Ria Sinha have written, where you actually argue about how aid to Bangladesh declined from 200 crores in 23-24 to 120 crores in 24-25, while the aid to Sri Lanka saw a 63% budgetary increase. How do you argue this position? Should India have decreased its aid to Bangladesh given a change in circumstance over there?
Yeah, those numbers I'd look at a little bit with care. What we explained in that article, Geeta, is that I think sometimes year on year is not an indicator of the political importance of that country, right? Where you want to invest, you have difficult relations, or do you want to squeeze another country diplomatically because you're not happy about a position they took. This is often tied to completion of projects. So you give aid, projects become completed, and actually often we've said that the decrease sometimes is a good sign because projects finally got implemented, sometimes after 20 years. In the case of Nepal, for example, the border roads that India built in the Terai, in the Madish, in 2002-3 onwards, or had been announced 20 years ago, finally were completed 2 years ago. It took 20 years, and therefore the aid for that project decreased. But the second shift that we discussed is also more important. The lines of credit for me are more interesting. And we have, I think, about 7 to 8 billion that were extended, dollars that were extended to Bangladesh in terms of lines of credit, including India's first ever defense sector-oriented line of credit. And there again, what I like looking more at, which the Bangladesh theory is not that good, is how much of those lines of credit have been utilized, because they tell you whether the country wants these projects, and they require India to also offer lines of credit for sectors that are in the requirement of that country. So improving the architecture also within the Ministry of External Affairs, for which you have to hire experts, you have to have a research ecosystem, you have to understand where are you equipped to give something, and where are countries in need of something that India can give at a better rate, at a faster time than, for example, China or any other country. So when we say a greater budget for the MEA, it's not necessarily only to offer things, but also be able to offer them where they are needed. That is a strategic long-term policy of which the MEA needs to much more. It has a very small development partnership administration that needs to be, quadrupled in terms of size, expertise, knowledge, so you can perform better, pursue Indian strategic interests in the neighborhood.
Well, the economic review is also out, and in that they are saying that instability in the globally is going to certainly affect and impact India, and the growth rate might not be as positive as it has been in the past, but yet they still seeing some growth. On that account, if we talk about how India is viewing a few things and how that could impact India because of the decisions being taken by Trump and the United States of America, let's begin with BRICS. A massive threat by Donald Trump on BRICS, saying that if they continue, there's going to be 100% tariff. How is this tariff war going to impact India and the Indian economy?
I mean, it's very difficult to guess as anything relating to
the whole
US
idea,
and Trump these days.
Yeah, can I just add, the whole idea about BRICS is the fact that Trump fears that every local currency transaction that BRICS is planning on having their own currency, a BRICS currency, is or will lead to de-dollarization of the global economy.
Yes, and India has taken steps in that regard. That's undeniable. India is allowing now rupee trade with some of its neighbors. It enforced some of these agreements over the
Including
last few
Russia.
years with Russia. But I think there the concern is also an opportunity because trade with the US is, of course, critical for India's exports. But I think what we've seen over the last years, in fact, what was driving something we just discussed, which is the focus on the global south, on Africa, on the neighborhood, and on these large economies where middle classes are growing. These are alternative markets for India to trade with. So while you will come under stress with Trump today, with a more protectionist Europe tomorrow, with other global north economies that are demographically in decline, frankly, it is critical for India to develop access to new consumer markets. Africa and the global south, which is again why we saw so much emphasis on the global south under the G20, but also frankly next door Bangladesh. India exported up to $15 billion worth. In fact, India-Bangladesh trade relations were, before the Ukraine war, 3 times more than what India traded with Russia. So
Yes.
an 8th largest country next door, Bangladesh, is in that sense increasingly important for India to find alternative trade markets for exports, but also for imports and supply chains with Southeast Asia. And there again, the political stability in these countries is very important, where you're going to need diplomatic resources to play a role in stabilizing these countries. That's very difficult, but nothing will happen in Bangladesh in the future that will lead to political stability unless India supports that and works with Bangladesh. And for that, again, you need more resources on the ground to play an important role through India's missions, for example. And let me just finish on that, something I've repeated many times, Geeta. I mean, if you don't have the people to perform diplomacy, to pursue India's interests on the ground, it's very difficult to identify opportunities and threats. And at less than 1,000 Indian Foreign Service offices today operating at headquarters in Delhi, across Indian states, connecting Indian central interests with state interests, and in 200 missions worldwide, 1,000 people will just not be able to perform that humongous task and very important ambition for the country around the world.
Well, again, a very, very important point. 1,000 IFS officers, and you're saying they are not enough, and that the Indian government will have to think of expanding the MEA, not just the budget, but also personnel.
And that's why you need budget for. It is critical. This is absolutely critical, Geeta. I think these are heroes, the IFS officers. They're absolute heroes in service of India's ambitious foreign policy. I think there's a formidable vision for the country. There's a difficult context, but to reach that to navigate that and reach the ambition of 2047 Viksit Bharat, a developed country, to navigate a tough neighborhood, which we just discussed, to navigate and engage an unpredictable, erratic president, which is your major partner worldwide in the United States, you will need a strong human resource system that is made of people, that are trade specialists, that are specialists in technology, that are specialists in health diplomacy, that are able to identify risks and opportunities in the digital domain, that speak a variety of languages to be on the ground and build political alliance with different groups. India needs to invest massively in that system, and for that you need a huge budget upgrade into capacity building, training, and certainly an IFS system that is not taking 30 to 40 people every year, but also performs lateral entry possibilities for people from the private sector, academia, and think tanks to support the system, works directly with a variety of constituencies that are interested and frankly at risk today, because most of India's growth today hinges on a benign regional and global environment, and to navigate it, you need that expertise.
Well, again, before I let you go, because this is a very important point and I would have left it at that, but there are two very important aspects, Constantino, that I'd like to ask you. One is that going back to the United States of America, that the United States of America and India do not see eye to eye on very major and basic economic issues and agenda, which have to do with how they're going to trade in the future. Two divergent points of view come from, one, the fact that US is really upbeat on crypto and India is not. On the other hand, the US president has gone ahead and said that they're not going to do any business on central bank digital currency prototypes, that's CBDC, and India is upbeat on CBDC because they say that printing money in currency form is way more expensive, and having the digital currency transaction as an option really helps. Not just this, there are about 130 countries that are looking at the system. How then can the two countries really work when we already have tariff issue, trade issue, and now it has to do with crypto and CBDC?
Big challenge, Geeta, but maybe I'm slightly less skeptical because we've seen this movie play out in the past on defense, technology, for example, huge incompatibilities in the system. We've seen these agreements affect the India-US relationship on climate, massive changes and massive differences back to Copenhagen 2009, President Obama and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh disengaging on what should be climate. In fact, President Obama calling India a disappointment on climate negotiations, expecting more. So I think on this issue, let's see how it plays out. The only thing I'd be more worried about is to monitor to what extent India will navigate towards a non-US camp, which is basically led by what you mentioned before,
China.
Two critical BRICS economies, Russia and China. So for example, on cyber diplomacy and internet governance, we see India's positions aligning closely, including one multilateral initiative that is being ratified with China and Russia, and taking exception from the US, which is basically disengaging from all multilateral major agreements, and will, I think, do more of that under Trump now over the next few years. So that's a challenge that's worth monitoring. It will affect the relationship, like you say, but I think one critical play here is the private sector. And when there are private sector interests, both in the US and India, are massively interested in each other. And President Trump, we know how responsive he is to private sector interests in the US. I think that could be an interesting opportunity to look at how maybe there can be bilateral engagements led by the allure of profitability, including on crypto. By the way, Bhutan, next door, tiny Bhutan is developing a crypto hub just across the Indian border. I doubt that would happen without Indian, at least, acquiescence and support. And we know there's a lot of American investors again and European investors interested in investing in Bhutan in that crypto sector.
Okay, finally, before I let you go, Constantino, your budget recommendations for the Indian government on MEA.
I think the budget is a great excuse to talk about ambition and commitment to deliver that gap. Budget is one of many pieces that the Indian system will have to think about to reform the way it engages with the world. I think the leadership has established a very ambitious vision for the country that is important. But to match that now with an upgrading of the engine, the financial, the structural, the human resources engine that drives it, which is not only the Ministry of External Affairs, it's also the Ministry of Defense and many other ministries that are engaging unprecedentedly today abroad, that needs to be rethought. And that's something we call state capacity, but it's very critical because we often only see the outcomes of what India achieves abroad, or we criticize India for failures. We don't see the hard work that needs to and is going into the process of achieving sometimes very silent victories that no one talks about. And often only the bad news reach the news. And I think it's very important to invest in that equipment, that engine that is going to drive India's foreign policy over the next few years, and massively revamp that. And that will require a hardcore political decision. That's not going to come from the bureaucracy or from others, nor from us outside. That's got to come from the top to say that we need to now, treble the size of the Indian Foreign Service, for example. Many missions have been opened, so we now need people to staff those missions at a way that is commensurate with India's ambition for the next 20 to 30 years.
Okay. On that note, Constantino Xavier, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global. Thank you.